Hey, welcome to the Cam and Otis Show. We're a father-son business podcast where we talk with other lifelong learners about making an impact and solving big problems. And we're lucky enough today to be joined by our good friend Luba from way up in the Boston area. Get confused when I start talking about towns up there. But Luba, it is so good to see you today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And you know what? I wanted to drop right into it today with the what is it that tech one pulled you into it, and two, how come ain't more women doing it?
Well, I have a funny story about how I got
Yeah.
into tech.
Oh
Are
yeah,
you ready?
I'm ready.
So I grew up, I'll give you a little bit of the prehistory. I grew up in Vilnius, Lithuania, former USSR, and I had impeccable soft skills, which had no value in former USSR whatsoever. Like if you weren't brilliant academically, what can you possibly be in this life? That was kind of how I grew up. But I came to US, I was 14, and I went to high school. And where before it wasn't even an option, like nobody expected me to go to college, or I loved doing my hair. So ever since I was 7, I was told hairdresser is the thing, like for you, like that's your passion, that's your love. And so I just grew up thinking hairdresser is it. I love it, like I enjoy it. But then in United States, I went to Brookline High School, and everyone around me was talking about college. Like it's almost like it wasn't an option, not to go. Why, I don't know, but everybody was talking about it. Especially since most of my friends at that time were immigrants. And so immigrant from China, from doesn't matter where from, but it was almost like the parents who are immigrants would tell their kids, there's a reason why we got here. Like this is the country of opportunities. Like you cannot not take advantage. Otherwise, why are we suffering through the change, through the move, right? Through working, and providing for you. And so I did go to college. I got accepted to Northeastern because I had no idea what I could potentially do. And I thought, I'm going to be art major. Why art? Don't ask me.
Art,
I
hair,
wanted to be a teacher.
that's the same. Yeah.
I mean, they didn't have a program for a hairdresser at Northeastern University.
So it's the natural jump.
So what was I to do? Yeah. And it's interesting. I wanted to be a teacher, but I also, like, my English wasn't even that great still either. Like it took me forever. I was not good at languages, just like not many other things. And so I had a hard time. And I remember this discussion vaguely now, but I think I said, well, I wanted to be a teacher, and some counselor or somebody said, well, you have to pick a major. And I think based on maybe what they had more availability in, I don't know, they said you can be math major, biology major, or art major with a certification in teaching. Biology was something that was very scary. Cutting the frog to me seemed unimaginable. Math, I was pretty strong in, but I wasn't confident enough, to be a math major. I mean, I liked it enough. And so art it was, although I had no natural talent in art, but why not? And so to make the story, to get to the story how I got into the tech, within 2 weeks, I met a man that I really, really liked, and he had a lot of confidence in me, and I really wanted to impress him. And so 6 months into my art major, after I stayed up till 5 a.m. to weave sweaters out of file folders and stuff like that, I went and I said, I want to switch to computer science. And they said, great. Oh, you got an A in math in the previous semester? Great. And so within 5 minutes, I had an acceptance letter to computer science, and I showed it to him, and I got the effect that I wanted. He was very impressed. He's still my husband now. And so that was it. So I got my undergrad to impress a man. And then My graduate was just for me. But by the graduate, I didn't want to impress anybody.
How
So
did you find that love of tech once you were in it? Because I can appreciate the like almost from the whim of like, I mean, shoot, I know we were talking in the green room where y'all were talking. My mic was messed up about my agriculture journey. It's pretty similar of just saying like, hey, go down to Texas, learn how to farm, and then I was like, I love this stuff. How did you fall in love with the tech?
so funny you should ask. I didn't at first. In fact, it's not like, oh, everything else up till that point was hard for me academically, and then all of a sudden I joined computer science and boom, I
Right.
found my passion. It wasn't like that. It was also a struggle. But I recently did this test to find my top strengths, and I asked this coach who was unpeeling it for me. I said, but how is it that I loved it so much? Like by default, by my top strengths, like I shouldn't have been that happy in that profession. And she said, and then it clicked to me. She said, well, positivity is your number one strength. So no matter what you see as positive, and then like the love for the people and developing people and collaboration, working with people. So I think I loved it for that aspect. So I was never like fascinated with new uh, gadgets and all of it, like typical engineers. Like I've been in that tech space, I've been in the kitchen areas where, the boys are just like fascinating, latest phone, latest this, latest that. And I just like, I didn't care. But what I loved about it was working with people. And even I think what made me successful in that field was because I had no ego and I had no expectations. I was never viewed as a threat to anyone. And if I would come up to a very smart, engineer and architect, and I would say, listen, can you explain to me how this works? They could explain 3 times. They didn't care. They enjoyed explaining. And so like eventually it would just click because it doesn't matter. Like if you're at it, right, consistently, eventually you learn. And so that's just how it came
So
about.
the second part of my question, and I'm not a very good host when I ask two really big questions back to back and stacking them. So, but I want to throw that out there is how come there's not more women in that tech space?
So I recently contributed to a book on diversity and equity, and so you see a couple like business leadership diversity here, and then there's business leadership and equity, and there's a third one coming up, and we talked about that. And I start my chapter with a story when I was 19, and I was doing my second internship by that point, and I asked my boss because it was 12 men, most from India, and me. And I said, listen, like, what's happening here? How come there are no women? And he said, and I knew he had nothing against women. He had a daughter my age. He was married. And he said, see that pile of resumes that I have? Not a single resume from a woman. So I got no pipeline. Like, how can I hire more women if, and then it just occurred to me, okay, I get it. Some classes there are 150 of us and 3 females, so it seemed legit. But I think it's changing. I mean, I'm 45, right? It was a while back, and I think more and more girls are going into STEM, and there's a lot more support and a lot more nonprofits. And back then, maybe it's the confidence, maybe it's the fact that like computer science wasn't that popular for women.
What's the
In United States, by the
Mhm.
way. In India, computer science seems very much for women.
Interesting, interesting. And what I was thinking, or just wondering about from your perspective, because men and women see problem sets differently, right? I always used to joke with Miss Suzanne about, you know, when we were in college and put pack in the MG because, it's such a small car, but I could visualize where all the parts and pieces went, right? The puzzle of it. But she could never do that because her mind didn't function that way. It was just pull everything in. Is there, have you noticed, I think is the way I want to ask this, Have you noticed a difference in that tech and coding between a woman who's writing a program and a man who's writing a program, and how they solve problems, if you will?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think in general, what I have seen many musicians going into the tech space, and the way their brain operates, it's an easy transfer into coding. But as far as, I studied over the years because I love people, and I actually love the psychology and getting into like how different we are or how similar. And there's this concept that I teach often. I taught an effective leadership workshop at Harvard Dental School, out of all the places. But the idea was to explain to them how they can be in the future best leaders, effective leaders, and build effective teams if they have their own dental practices. And a lot of this is transferable, right, tech to any space. And I talked about social styles, right? There are 4 quadrants, and some people are extremely analytical, like they're very analytical, and some are very amiable, like they care about people. And then they're expressives, that like they make decisions very quickly, and then there's some that just they want to get stuff done, right? So like delivery for them is much higher priority than people and feelings and stuff. And so if you think about the 4 quadrants, most of the typical engineers, men and women, it doesn't matter, they're more in the analytical space. And yes, you have some expressives as well who write the code, but just in general, not that I want to put people in quadrants, but there are many men that are very expressive, and there's some typical, kind of expectation of a gender. But as far as who makes best coders or different, I don't know, and how the brain works, I didn't find the difference. I've worked with extremely brilliant women engineers as well.
There's a study I remember reading about a year or so ago, talking about similar type of thing of women in STEM and ways that they can affect the change and that kind of stuff. And I'm hearing a lot of the things I saw in that study in your story there, of like the biggest piece that they found, or what the people doing the study thought was the biggest factor, was the lack of role models. Of not necessarily that the men would not treat the women well, but it's just you're more likely to follow somebody who looks like you, is more like you as you're going forward. If you see a woman in a high level role, you can say, look, I can go do that. And then they can help you along the way there. But then I think there's another couple pieces that you really hinted at. One is, there are in male dominated industries, there are just the barriers of, I'm a guy, I love my rugby boys and all that kind of thing. I also know what it's like to be in a room with 60 rugby guys. And I know that a lot of people, women or men, don't want to be in that kind of an environment. So I know that those type of things have lots of factors. But then I think another really interesting piece, and you really hinted at this, Luba, is the kind of generational perspective around it. You mentioned India, where they don't look at tech as a male dominated field. And I think that's one of the most interesting things I remember from that study, is how many of these male-dominated fields stay that way because we call them as such. That it is male-dominated, so people just self-select away from it. Or even in the case of the social pressure of, one of your girlfriends is going for it, and you say, oh, really? Come on, you don't want to be in that. You want to go this way. And all of these little social pressures can build up to create so many different barriers. And the reason I bring that up is because I think those different factors are so interesting when you're trying to solve the problem there. In your experience, out of those factors, or maybe some other things that you've seen, what do you think is the bigger barrier, or maybe the thing that is easier to change, looking at getting more women involved in STEM?
So I can tell you what I am now working so hard on to change, because I feel so strongly that this is almost like number one reason why women either don't get into STEM, or they're in STEM but they're not progressing in their careers, or whatever that may be. And it's the confidence. It's that confidence that I can do whatever it is that I can do. It's very common now. Everyone talks about it, that if I look at a job description, and if I even 98% is a match, I'll say, oh, but the 2%, I don't really qualify, right? And I won't apply, where a man will look at the 60% like, yes,
Yeah.
I'm perfect for it.
The risk aversity.
That is so still, I see it all the time. And I've mentored over, at some point I went into the leadership, and I've mentored hundreds of people, both men and women. And I'm focusing on women now as part of my company, because I see it, just the confidence level and the doubts is like up there in comparison to a man. Like and maybe men have doubts, but then they don't talk about it. I don't know. But with women, it's very
I'd
visible.
say on the doubt piece in men, I've actually talked about this in some of my rugby groups and sports groups, because I think if you talk about stereotypical men things, I think they tend to go more into those type of groups anyway. But it's that you're not allowed to show, and Dad, you've talked about this in the Army, if you're not allowed to show that weakness, you have to show that confidence all the time. Because if you're not confident, no one else is going to want to be around you. You have to have that confidence. It's like the barrier to entry. But I think the really interesting thing,
yeah, if you're not confident, it's not sexy. Like, you gotta be the man.
Exactly. And I think what's interesting is, you saying the number one barrier is confidence. I think every other, example we talked about really is just confidence. What does seeing somebody in the position that you want, that looks like you, give you? It gives you confidence that you can get there. What does a barrier to entry give you? Less confidence that you can get past that barrier, and all of these different things. So I love how you put that all into that bucket of confidence. Now, how do we teach the confidence? Besides listening to this episode.
See, I am working on a TEDx talk, and it's exactly about that. It's exactly about that, because I started jokingly, imagine a workplace where all employees are effective and efficient and accountable. Mm-hmm. And then I pause and I say, were you able to do that? And if someone raises their hand, I'll say, great, let's talk after, because I still can't. However, my dream is to see the world where all people, especially women, have the confidence, in their ability to achieve unimaginable. And the way you do that, not to give all the answers, because then you won't watch the TEDx talk, but it took a lot about taking something scary, something big, and breaking it down into smaller chunks that are less scary, more achievable. And as you tackle them one-on-one, but consistently, you build that confidence piece by piece, and it works. I know it.
It does. And I'm laughing because it reminds me of a story our good friend Scott told us about on the show a while back, and talking about, how do you eat an elephant, and using that metaphor with a bunch of high school kids. And one of the kids in the audience raised his hand and said, Mr. Scott, we're not actually going to eat an elephant, are we? But that's I think the lesson there is the metaphor, the language you use. The principles are the same, but the language you use to get the point across is so different. And you've talked a little bit about building that confidence both in working with both men and women. Have you found a dividing line where this reference works with men, this reference works better with women, or something along those lines?
Not really. What is a big difference, and again, let me say that just to make sure I get it out there. I've never felt like I'm out of place. I never felt discriminated as a woman in tech. I personally never experienced that. I know many women do, but in general, I haven't. I've always had men respect me, and I have friends for life from previous jobs. So, but men do have higher ego. That's just the fact. Yeah. And so it's the higher ego too, that women are more likely, from what I see, are open. Not all women, but the women who are ready to grow and learn, they're open for feedback. They're open for learnings. They're open for teachings and all of it. And many men do now as well. But the higher up in the organization you go, that's where you have the higher ego, and that's where it's the hardest.
I think,
because they got where they got by being the way they
there's
are.
kind of that the selection process on the way up there can kind of breed for that negative trait, which that's a whole nother issue there, talking about creating those incentive systems, right? But yeah, exactly.
Podcast.
That's part two. But one point I wanted to make, as we're talking about these differences and, gender, and then Luba, I like what you said earlier of it's like, we're not putting them in the two buckets and then we spread it out into the quadrants, because when we're talking about these things, there's so many different buckets you can put people in, and everyone's in all these different things. And I think that there's an important piece of when we talk about certain characteristics as being male or female. I think the thing that usually gets missed is it a effective trait, and then how effective can it be? Like, I think of a conversation I had with some friends the other day and it's like, somebody used the phrase of, it's like, came in with that man's confidence to a room where he didn't know what he was doing. He just started talking. And it's like, that, it's kind of like what you're saying there. It's like, that confidence isn't a bad thing. People should have that confidence. It shouldn't be a male trait, it shouldn't be a female trait. People always talk about the empathy that women tend to have. Empathy is a good thing. These are things that we should be looking at in the broader sense there. And I just want to make sure we got that point, because there's so many differences, but I think too often it becomes a this bucket, that bucket, instead of, okay, hey, what is this trait? Is that trait an effective thing to use in your life? And if it is, then we should be working towards it, like you're talking about with confidence.
I do have to say, confidence sometimes is not a positive trait either. You got to be very careful with that one.
Yeah.
And when like some of the examples I think of is, if I'm not confident about something, I am more likely to put in more work and prepare more for something. And so when I show up, I do a better job. What I deliver is more consumable to people, more succinct, like more to the point, versus if you're too confident and you think, I can wing it. And then you show up, and there's some places, because I now think of TEDx and just TED Talks, and I've watched like so many now just to see like what style I like, what makes sense more for me. And I've seen TEDx talks where people show up to wing it. It doesn't work. So it's like, okay, wow, that confidence was very high right there. Right? A little more prep would have gone a long way.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. I'm wondering, because you touched on a couple of things that, the soft skills you were really good at as a young lady, and then went to the university with this aspect of being a teacher, but then ended up coding. When did this transformation, if you will, or maybe it was more of an identification of a personal gap in your life? When did that happen? That, hey, I want to help. The tech stuff's cool, but I want to help people again.
So it happened very early in my career. Now I knew the first time that I wanted to teach and help was, I was a junior in high school, and I had a friend who was struggling in math. And I helped her to prove some kind of a theorem. I don't even remember anymore. But I still remember, it was years ago. We're talking about 45. I was junior in high school. I still remember this girl at the time running towards me with that piece of paper and a big A, right? Like, she took a quiz and she got an A. She was so happy. And that feeling of the satisfaction was through the roof. Like, I loved that moment, that my little help, like half hour I spent with her, helped her out. And so when I graduated from undergrad and I was coding, I was fixing bugs in the code. I was about a hands-on engineer for about 7 years or so. And then in the tech space, there's agile way of working. It's a certain methodology where, instead of working on the requirements for months, coding for months, testing for months, then deploying, and 2 years later the customer looks at it and says, that's not what I asked for. There's this concept of agile methodology where you break it down in smaller chunks, and each small chunk goes through the development and testing and deployment, and brings value to the customer. That's an agile methodology. And there are certain frameworks to make that happen. And so Scrum framework, which has certain roles, certain meetings, certain artifacts, it's a way for you to achieve that agile methodology. And so there's a role called Scrum Master, and it's the person who facilitates a lot of meetings, really cares about the team. The servant leadership is all about people, and the Scrum Master is the role just in the middle of it. And so when I was still doing hands-on engineering work, someone said, listen, we need a Scrum Master on our team. And I said, huh? That's a funny sounding job title. A Scrum I don't want to be anybody's master. And what is Scrum? And so they handed me this big thing and said, well, read up on it. Because we all got certified, but we don't have anyone who actually knows it or wants to do it or could do it. But it's about people. Like, you are protecting the team from all this work coming your way. You're, taking care of any kind of conflict. You remove impediments. You work on the team being more efficient and more effective. And also you work with leadership, because leaders need transparency. Leaders need to forecast, right? Leaders they have their own needs. And so the Scrum Master is like in between. And I liked it. And I found this new passion for this way of working. And I really believed in this way of working, because when I was a developer, when I was an engineer, I worked the other way, where somebody would just hand me the thing to do. I had no idea how it fit in a bigger picture. And so I said, okay, like, this thing works. Let me be that. Like, I'll try it. So I kind of wore a double hat. And then I had a colleague who asked me to be the Scrum Master on his team to begin with. He moved on to another company, and for 3 months, he just kept persuading me, come join my company, do the Scrum Master full time. Like, you love it, you are good at it, it's your thing, do it. And so I did, 3 months into it. And then, I don't know, a couple of months into me being at that job, my boss came over and said, we're going to hire 200 engineers, and we need you to build a team of Scrum Masters and agile coaches. And of course, the confidence in me at that point said, me managing people, me leader. And he said, okay, well, show me who's a better candidate. Like, who knows Scrum and who knows agile from everyone that we have here more than you? And I said, I guess you got a point. And so that's how I hired people. But even back then, I think, because I didn't have the ego, and I keep coming back to the ego because I've seen how ego gets on the way of people's careers. Because I didn't have it, and I knew that I lacked the experience and the skill. I loved it, but I knew that my knowledge and experience was very limited. And all of a sudden it's 200 engineers and they're transforming the whole organization. Like, I just didn't have enough. And so the way I hired people and I built that team was I hired many people that knew a lot more than me. And then I hired a couple who I could teach. And so it was this combination where I learned a lot, and I also kind of gave back. I gave back. I was the reason for a few people's careers. And it's very satisfying when they send you a message 6 years later saying, thank you for, my life now that I love. And so that was very addictive to me. And I went to another job where I had to build another team like that, very large team of Scrum Masters and Agile coaches, and transform a large company. And just that mentorship part was absolutely my favorite. I didn't care about approving time cards and performance reviews. That part I didn't enjoy. And so that's why I started my own company, where I still, do consulting and I go in, but I don't have direct reports, but I hopefully am making impact on many people's careers and their confidence level.
Do you miss that part? Because that's a really interesting thing that I'd love to hear your perspective of, the organic team that you lead and you build and you grow to achieve a vision. Vice, let me go help their team achieve a vision that they want. How's that sounding with you? Do you feel that difference?
I do feel the difference. There is a I guess a slight nuance there, but it is all about people.
Mm.
So, and it depends like what you care about. Um, so as my full-time employment, I go to clients. And what I do there, it really depends on what the client needs. So one of my engagements was to go and upskill 19 product owners. It's another role within the Scrum framework. They're product managers. They're the people who have the vision, who are working on the requirements and stuff like that, and organizing them in a way that is consumable to the developers and QA engineers. And so if you think about it, I am also making a difference in those people's careers because I'm upskilling them. So yes, I didn't build that team. Sometimes it's a little bit frustrating where I know they could grow much faster, but like maybe their managers don't understand what they
Mm.
do. And I have no influence, outside of maybe this 19 people in a very certain, very limited capacity. But on the other hand, when I was in the position to say, work with HR and give someone a raise, it was extremely satisfying. But there were also many cases where I couldn't make it happen, and it was very frustrating. It's like, I understand you have no budget, but this person is 10,000 underpaid at least, right? And like, and it's almost like, and now it's your job to get this person to the equal pay, but your hands are tied, and so it's tough. There are pros and cons in both, but I don't know.
Yeah, you get that wider range or that wider range of effect, but you also get the less control over each individual piece. I think that's really interesting. Reminds me of a conversation we had with James Kluski recently talking about athletes transitioning to coaching, whether or not it scratches the itch. I'm curious if that itch, that thing you enjoyed so much as a scrum master and really being in it and building up those teams, do you think that your work now consulting scratches that itch, or do you think there's still a little bit of a gap there of more to be desired?
So what I do as a consultant a lot, and like specifically like in my current engagement, I help Scrum Masters who are maybe less experienced. So I'm an agile coach. Now I go in and they're Scrum Masters and they're product owners. My job is to coach them, work very closely with new teams that are launching, that want to embrace this agile way of working. And I do a lot of training and I do a lot of coaching of Scrum Masters and product owners, which is perfect. I am making a difference. I am just not too hands-on. Like you can go very deep on the project and understand all the details that are happening, or you can stay higher up and just cover more teams and more scrum masters and be there to support more. And but that's just when you become a manager, right, or a director. Like at some point you gotta go a little bit wider than deeper. And so um, that's exactly what I do now for the full-time job. So in that aspect, it's fine. And sometimes I've had someone reach out and said, can you help us out to create a Jira board? And Jira is a project management tool with metrics and all this wonderful stuff. It was a couple of years ago. And you know what? I had to roll up my sleeves and I said, I hadn't done it in like 8 years. But I used to do it a lot. Like as a Scrum Master, you
Mm.
have to. And guess what? Click, click, click. It's like riding a bike, and things come up. And so we did. We set up the Jira boards and the dashboards, and we set up the metrics that they could report on to their leadership. And honestly, that gave me a lot of satisfaction. But is that all I want to do? 8 hours a day? No, like it's no longer interesting to me because I've done it.
Do a deep
What's
dive once a
your
year
escape?
and get that itch.
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah.
Well, and speaking of that, I'd love to hear what your escape mechanism is. I mean, professional woman,
Escape.
mother, wife. What's your escape mechanism? What do you do to get out of it? Go recharge.
Well, I am a skier, so I absolutely love downhill skiing. And in the winter, it's very easy. I go, if I can't ski for whatever reason, I also enjoy snowshoeing up the mountain. And when you go and there's nature around you, and it's gorgeous, it's beautiful. I love to go on walks. I love to walk by the ocean in the summer. That's my thing. Recently, I met someone who teaches boxing. He's a boxing coach, and he came over, and I did a little bit of that too. That gave me a lot of
I hope you
satisfaction.
warned your husband first. I just want to say.
You know what? Honestly, it was a 6 a.m. near our gym. My husband is fine. I came home with a big smile, sweating, and I got the exercise out of the way. It was 6:45. I don't think he even noticed that I was gone. So fine.
I
All
was
good.
more worried about using him as a punching bag. That's what I was worried about.
I would never do that. I am not a violent person. Like, yeah.
So go ahead, Kim.
So one thing that I always like to ask people about who are in the tech world, and especially, you being more in the coding, and, having that background, is how do you think that influences the way you see problems? Because the rest of us are working in a field of constraints. In coding, you get to build your own constraints. If you don't like the thing you're working on, you can build a whole new language so that you can work in a different set of constraints. So how does that influence the way that you see problems?
That's a tough one. I can say how, like, recent was a very interesting example. I look at things very differently because of my background. I'm not sure about, it's not about tackling problems, but it's just, someone launches a website. First thing I go is I freaking click on every single thing. Oh, I'm going to join this community. And I'm immediately like reporting bugs. I'm like, before anybody else clicks on it, just watch out. Like, this thing doesn't work. And that gets me in there. So because I did a lot of like quality assurance as well. And so like that mindset to quickly make sure that, find all the things that are not working and fix them, that is definitely still there. But as far as, I think it's just having the background. I think I just have the confidence that everything is fixable. And the whole thing of innovation, that there are really no constraints. Like, you can imagine the craziest thing ever, and it's feasible. Like, it's possible to build and bring to life.
I think the other piece of perspective I wanted to ask, and this is going back to the beginning of the episode, is, I'm sure you get asked a lot about the immigrating to Boston and that kind of perspective. What I'm more curious about, to try to ask a slightly different question than you normally get, is you talked about most of your friends being immigrants. How did that shape your worldview, shape the way that you saw the U.S. or anything like that? And the fact that it wasn't just you coming to Lithuania, you were there with a Chinese kid, you were there with, Spanish, all these different people that were going through that same kind of a journey as you.
It definitely widened my horizon, right? Because when I grew up, right, there was no TikToks and internet. So it's not like I could at least understand other worlds, through other means. Our friend group back in high school was awesome. And I think what made us closer too was, when you come at 14, forget about just in general me not being that confident, but when you don't speak English, and often you're made fun of because you don't speak English, and there are some mean children out there in high school, and you can speak English and not be afraid that you are speaking crappy English, because all of them are speaking crappy English. We met each other in English as a second language. And so, oh my God, how we communicated, I look back, I still don't know, but we all understood each other. And we had a great time, whether it's through pictures or signs or sounds or whatever. We would walk from school home, and we had a ton of fun.
Miss Suzanne had that same experience in Germany. Because she went to the Volkshochschule to learn German with the immigrants to Germany. and she always tells that story about that same thing when they all kind of cross this threshold about the same time in language, understanding. So now they have the common language of German to talk. And I remember when she came home that night, it was like, well, Mustafa's here for this, and Alfred is, his wife has this problem, and they're doing it. It was like all of a sudden so there's actually people in the class with you, because you have that all of a sudden a common way to communicate. And what a powerful thing to have and truly understand how that really built a tight knit community for you in high school. And that,
And we would show, we would show each other homework, and we would like compare our answers and be like, with a face like, really? And then somebody else would be like, oh. And so, sometimes it's like very few words, but say if someone got a D because they had no idea what the assignment was, somebody would just come over and give you a hug, because they knew that you didn't like the fact that you got a D because you had no idea what the assignment was. And so even those like little things, there was a lot of empathy towards each other. Because everybody...
Did you have that? Because you talked about your love of people, and did you have that much when you're younger? Because I could also see how that environment of just being able to look and reading the facial expressions, the physical, those type of the word that comes to mind is like love languages, but those type of things of communication do you think that's where that love of people really fostered?
To be honest with you, I think some of it is you're born with. There's certain things that you're just born with. I was in 5th grade. There's a very interesting story, and I still, again, visually remember this girl. We had a girl who stayed behind. Now, in former USSR, I don't know how it is here. I don't know anyone who stayed behind a whole grade. But over there, it was a big deal. You really had to fail absolutely everything for you to stay a grade behind. And so we were in the 5th grade, and this girl stayed behind. And not only she was just bigger than all of us, but, and this might not be very relatable now in our world with all the dyed hair and shaved hair and this and that, but back in former USSR at that time, I mean, unless you were going through something horrible health-wise, girls had the hair that they were born with. And this girl had half of her head shaved. And because you weren't allowed, she had the other half kind of covering the shave like this, right, with a ponytail. And then the second the bell rang, she would kind of go outside and go like this and be this kind of odd-looking girl. And so when she came in the 5th grade, I felt so horrible for her. And I kept helping her. I was terrified of her, just of the looks and the way she was just bigger. But I was still nice to her. And so, I did get a nickname like Mother Teresa, and kids were making fun of the fact that I'm helping her. But I do remember my need to help her. Why, I have no idea. I was a little girl. I didn't know anything about anything. So I think some of it is natural.
What a fun story to think about, and that far back and that influence, and especially in the the culture and the environment that you were in the USSR, and how restricted things were back then, and there weren't a whole lot of options to be an individual. So that's that.
But it could be also because I grew up with loving parents and loving grandparents, so I think maybe that environment also helps. And yes, most of the teachers were pretty mean, but my family was all very nice, extremely nice people. So
yeah,
I'll give some.
I just want to add, just because I think it's an interesting piece of the story, but also and I'll send y'all both this podcast, but talking about cultural rigidity, and one of the areas that they talked about that is the least rigid culturally is former USSR places, because you get this, when you're so strict for so long, you get this huge rebellion towards what you're talking about, Luba. And I just had to throw that out there. Again, that's a whole other podcast, but had to add it.
Man, so I was reminded because I'm familiar with the Scrum Master. I worked in a tech company for a few years, and that was kind of the process we used. We actually used Jira too, so I even know what that is, which is very unusual for somebody like me. Uh, but I love the reminder of the fact that the Scrum Master is really about managing the people. It's not about the code. It's not about getting in and
Serving
yes,
people,
serving the
serving
people.
more.
There you go. Even better way to put it. So, yeah, that's such a great reminder that uh, even in this super tech world, everybody thinks it's all about the ones and zeros. That it still takes the people, and it still takes leadership, and it still takes a human touch involved in there to build that team and get the product out. So I thought that was great. So thank you for that. Camden, what'd you learn?
First, I got to say, I was thinking this whole time of, gosh, do you think I could change my assistant coach rugby title to Scrum Master? Because I coach scrums, so it could work. But I guess I do other stuff too, so it doesn't
Same
really
thing,
work.
yeah.
Yeah,
It's definitely
maybe Scrum and Line Out Master. I don't know.
It came from anyway. Look up the history of Scrum, and you'll be surprised where it came from.
I need to check that out. We'll see which way it goes. But no, the thing I learned and is just the importance of confidence. It was kind of amazing to me as we went through our conversation. Everything kept going back to confidence and just how important confidence is to get what you want out of life and to go create the career that you want. You have to be confident that you can go get it. And I think the other piece of that is the importance of us as the later generations of teaching that confidence and building that confidence up inside of the youth so that they can go move forward with that. So that was it for me.
Luba, how about you? What'd you learn?
Well, I learned that there's a lot of curiosity about the difference in the gender. Right? Like you asked a lot of questions, but what's the difference? But no, but how do like men code versus women code? No, but how? And I'm not surprised, but it was a reminder just how people still view and just the curiosity about that thought process and the outlook on things, and it's interesting.
Yeah, well, and part of my curiosity for that comes from one of the things that I'm very familiar with, which is shooting. And there's been tons of studies. I mean, like real studies, not just Otis and Miss Suzanne going to the range, but tons of studies that show that women can shoot better than men. And so I was just curious how that applies and maybe in the whole tech industry. So that's where I was
I
launching
think
it
I
from.
learned that I want to learn more. Right? I
Yeah.
learned that I want to learn more.
Yeah, that's always good.
I have not thought about it that much, about the difference.
There you go. There's your next book, right?
There you go. There's a pile of ideas now. It'd be like book number 10.
Awesome. Luba, how can folks get in touch with you, find you, see what you got going on next?
Well, I am not shy. So anyone who just Googles my name, Luba Sakharuk, like seriously online, I come up all over. But probably the easiest would be LinkedIn. Again, you just have to type LUBA and here I am. Like it's not that hard for me, for folks to find me on LinkedIn. I do have a website, lubasakharuk.com, like first name, last name. The name of my company also gets you to the same site, which is RALM3.com, RALM3. And that's probably a very good start.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure and a lot of fun hanging out with you.
Thank you.
Camden, run us out.
All right. Thank you all for listening to the Cam and Otis Show, and a special thanks to our guest, Luba Sakharuk, for joining us today. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to pass along to someone else so they can enjoy it too. Make sure to follow the Cam and Otis Show on Facebook and Instagram, and you can watch full videos of the show on our YouTube page. And while you're there, hit that subscribe button too. As always, the full archive of our episodes is available at www.camandotisshow.com. Thanks again, and we'll see y'all next time.